It's also an ongoing discussion in the International Monetary Fund and in the G20, the 20 strongest economies of the world, how to find mechanisms to move money from surplus to deficit nations in order to stabilize the global economy. Another issue discussed in the international community is a revival of the US Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. I don't know if you've heard about that, forcing a separation between normal banks taking deposits from the common man and woman and investment banks, which were allowed to gamble on shares and futures but banned from taking deposits. And the idea, you can also put it into this post-Keynesian tradition, because if you separate those two sorts of banks, you could sort of say isolate this unstable element that is formed by those investment banks handling with more speculative money. And also the so-called Basel Committee on Banking Supervision and the Financial Stability Board, an association of 24 national regulators and central banks, have recommended a more hands-on supervision of the financial sector. So you have seen those last years a certain trend to more of control and regulation of the financial sector. Well, now I come to the second sort of resistance. And in this case, you really can talk about resistance more than alternative. The anti-globalization movement, the so-called, some of the persons defined as anti-globalization say that we don't want to be called anti-globalizations. We want to be called, we are critical against neoliberal globalization or something like that. And you could say, go back a little in history. Before 2008, few challenged the global financial system. But one of the early warners was the 1981 Economy Prize winner James Tobin. Already in 1972, he suggested a currency transaction tax in order to dampen the movements on the global financial market. And in December 1998, Ignacio Ramonet wrote in Le Monde Diplomatique an editorial in which he advocated the establishment of the Tobin tax and the creation of an organization to pressure governments around the world to introduce the tax. A TAC was created on June 3rd, 1998, during a constitutive assembly in France. ATTAC spread very fast in other countries and can be seen as the first major organization in what was to be called the anti-globalization movement. In 2001, the first World Social Forum met in Porto Alegre, Brazil. A charter was approved that said, the World Social Forum is an open meeting place for reflective thinking, democratic debate of ideas, formulation of proposals, free exchange of experiences and interlinking, for effective action by groups and movements of civil society that are opposed to neoliberalism and to domination of the world by capital and any form of imperialism, and are committed to building a planetary society directed towards fruitful relationships among mankind and between it and the earth. And here is the sort of flag. And also, if you take ATTAC's International, their goals in 2003 was to hamper international speculation, to tax income and capital, to penalize tax havens, to prevent the generalization of pension funds, to promote transparency investments in dependent countries, to establish a legal framework for banking and financial operations in order not to penalize further consumers and citizens. Employers of banking institutions can play an important role in overseeing these operations. to support the demand for the general annulment of the public debt of dependent countries and the use of the resources thus freed in behalf of populations and sustainable development, which many call paying off the social and ecological debt. More generally, the goals are to reconquer space lost by democracy to the sphere of finance, to oppose any new abandonment of national sovereignty on the pretext of the rights of investors and merchants, rights within quotation marks, to create a democratic space at the global level. You could say that perhaps this was on the height of the attack movements, sort of, or perhaps they already then were on the downhill, because those were the years when everyone began to say that the capitalist market worked very well, and I think you could say that attack had a very big problems. I could say perhaps also that those ideas came too early, because now quite a number of those ideas you could find in more established organizations as the International Monetary Fund. And I think it's fair to say that it's very much a question of taking back together the future of the world. Yeah, that is what they say. It is simply a question of taking back together the future of our world. And this moment were very critical against what was called free trade. I have discussed with Ermé a little this concept free trade. Originally, free trade only meant the liberty, the freedom for individuals or enterprises to buy things from wherever they thought best and sell things to whoever they wanted to sell to. And now you could say that is also an effect of the sort of neoliberal concept. In the concept of free trade is also included the sort of WTO regulations protecting big multinational companies, protecting their rights to take patents and to hinder free trade in certain circumstances. So I think you must see the ideological element of this concept free. It's the same if you take the discussion about so-called free schools here in Sweden. Free school, that means a privately owned school. Has that so very much to do with freedom? Well, can be discussed. Well, anyway, we had a discussion, first of all, within the WTO. Countries in the south, like India and Brazil, wanted to get rid of agriculture regulations and export subsidies in the European Union and the United States. A famous example is that in Nairobi, that was some years ago, you could only buy Danish butter. Why? Because European Union, because of the subsidies to agriculture, had a very big surplus of butter exported to a very low price to countries like Kenya, and that destroyed, of course, every possibility for local producers to compete. So therefore those countries wanted to get rid of those subsidies. And they also wanted to get rid of the high US tariffs on cotton, where especially poor African countries wanted access to the northern markets and eliminate or substantially reduce the northern subsidies in agriculture. But the northern countries were not prepared to agree to those demands from the south if the southerners did not cut their tariffs on industrial products significantly and also follow the agreement on trade-related aspects of international property rights, the so-called TRIPS agreement, now a part of the WTO rules. If you take a famous example, the multinational company Monsanto wanted to patent its method of producing a transgenic plant with increasing heat tolerance, salt tolerance, and drought tolerance, so-called GMO. But all over the world, farmers, together with the anti-globalization movement, have protested, claiming that GMO have long-term negative environmental consequences, and also that the company have stolen ideas that have existed for a very long time. So you could, of course, also say that those small farmers, in a certain respect, they defend free trade, their own freedom to produce their own local products based on local knowledge that now Monsanto, companies like Monsanto, tries to expropriate and take patent on. So that's this concept of free trade is a little.
Isn't it like related to food sovereignty and not the liberal idea of free trade? I mean, it's that farmers defend the idea of free trade, as you say, but connected to food sovereignty and not the idea of liberal free trade?
Yes. Yes, you could say that they defend the sort of sovereignty for themselves, that we can sell and even buy from local producers and so on. But I am a little against this liberal free trade, because liberalism in the beginning was just this idea, the right for everyone to take a job that you wanted to take yourself, not be commanded to take a certain job. So I don't think that this sort of big companies wanting to take patent on this, that is not liberal. It has nothing to do with liberalism in its original sense. It's this sort of, it's capitalist power liberalism. And it's also called neoliberalism. But I think that as the freedom concept, as well as the liberal concept, has been stolen, in my view, by those persons actually defending the power for people who have very much power already. A problem and a strength for the anti-globalization movement was its heterogeneity. French peasants defending the common agricultural policy of the EU had to go side by side together with leftist young idealists attacking the same policy for its negative effects in poor countries. Or progressive but anti-feminist liberation priests in Latin America, Catholic Church had to go side by side together with feminist pro-abortion and women priests activists. You could find those situations, and that was, of course, not so simple. If you follow the declarations from the forum meetings and from the leading figures, almost all of them were men. Is that unfair to say? Don't think so. You find a lot of goals to hamper, to oppose, to penalize globalization and reconquer and take back national sovereignty, then concrete suggestions on how the new world order should look like. But the movement could also register some minor victories. And if you take this Tobin tax, it had a sort of breakthrough in 2011 when the European Commission proposed a tax on financial transactions between financial institutions, charging 0.1% against the exchange of shares and bonds, and 0.01% across derivative contracts. And here you have the blue countries who were for. 11 states accepted the tax to be implemented initially by 1st of January 2014, later postponed to 1st of January 2016. The blue ones are requesting to participate, the red ones, EU members, not participating. I'm ashamed to say that Sweden is against. We will see now with the new government, but I'm afraid nothing will happen. And I am also afraid because resistance was and is extremely strong from Britain and states in the north and east. And it's still uncertain if this ever is going to happen. It's also, of course, a problem to introduce the tax. Tobin's suggestions was a global tax, because if you only introduce it in those 11 states, then you have a big problem. It will be money floating to other countries. It's the same with the tax on flights. You know, EU also have decided that to take a tax on fuel for flights, but China and United States, most of the world is against. And it's very difficult to take out this tax only in Europe. So it's the same here. Perhaps you must do it on the global scale. Yeah, and the French and Germans, they say pushed for a global tax on cross-border financial transaction, but the United States, no. Okay, now I come to the revolutionaries. The anti-globalization movement and also the traditional left is bluntly disabused by Hart and Negri. They accuse them for their conspiracy theories about globalization as a result of neoliberalism and for crying over the disappearing national state. Here is a crying leftist. And they say, the NGOs have an essential role in mobilizing public opinion behind humanitarian interventionism, but they are also the subordinates to the empire. They are sort of vassals to the empire. They reject any idea that the United States can be described as an imperialist power, for empire excludes any state-based imperialism. They acknowledge that the US is at the top of the international power hierarchy, but they conjure away the significance of this fact with the claim that a political system without a center of decision cannot be an empire. And they say, the empire can thank its existence to the heroic mass struggles that shattered the Eurocentric old regime of national states and colonialism. The empire is strong, but also decadent. This you can find the sort of Marxist dialectical thinking. Good that it shattered the old states, but it's also decadent. It is vulnerable at riot and rebellion. And the multitude, they wrote a new book called just The Multitude. The wretched of the earth, its omnipresent have-nots, form an already existing collective subject who is going to change the world in a revolutionary way. The mode of production of the multitude reappropriates wealth from capital and also constructs a new wealth. What does it mean? I am very uncertain. the increasing importance of immaterial intellectual labor in high value added sectors of the economy is shaping a collective laborer with heightened powers of subversion. So the multitude embrace all those who work, from computer scientists to slum dwellers. Here I think they have a very interesting point. I will come back to this sort of thinking, because it's a new situation with intellectual labor being more important in the big international firms. And the empire will be defeated through proletarian cooperation. And in this proletarian cooperation, evidently those high-skilled intellectual laborers also are included, which is a little peculiar, but okay. But of course, empire has met a lot of critics. And one of the more famous is, who is this? Yeah, Tariq Ali. He wrote in 2002, empire is a very stimulating account of globalization, but it's hopelessly wrong on two central issues. The state has not withered away. Strong states still exist, USA, China, Germany, etc. But the difference with the past is that there is now only one empire, and this is not the nebulous entity imagined by cultural studies, but a real living organism, and it has a name, the United States of America. You can also say that, who is that? Galtung. I met him in 1965, a very funny man. But he is, in my taste, rethinking too much and too often. But okay, it's interesting. He agrees that US imperialism is weakened, but he claims that it's still strong, and he keeps elements of the neo-mercantilist perspective. Where there is imperialism, there is unequal exchange between center and periphery. It's a quotation from a text from 2009. Okay, then on September 17, 2011, New York City's Wall Street financial district was occupied by protesters. They received global attention and spawned the Occupy movement worldwide. And one of the movement's leading figures is David Graeber. In the Democracy Project from 2014, he makes a similar analysis as Hartz and Negris. In certain aspects, it's similar. One genuinely disastrous failure of the mainstream left has been its ability to produce a meaningful critique of bureaucracy. While the new free market ideology has itself framed itself above all as a rejection of bureaucracy, it has in fact been responsible for the first administrative system that has operated on a planetary scale, while its endless layering of public and private bureaucracies, the IMF, World Bank, WTO, the trade organizations, financial institutions, transnational corporations, NGOs, this is precisely the system that has imposed free market orthodoxy and allowed the opening of the world to financial pillage under the watchful aegis of American arms. A quarter of the American population is now engaged in guard labor, defending property, supervising work, or otherwise keeping their fellow Americans in line. He tries to turn sort of the right-wing ideology upside down. I mean, what the fundamentalist neoliberal market friends say is that we get rid of all bureaucrats, and of course they can hold up Soviet Union and the immense bureaucracy there as a negative example. But what Graeber says, as a matter of fact, this system now is more controlled. Lots of people sitting in the United States especially supervising the world, listening to every telephone call all over the world and controlling. And what the left hasn't understood is that this is the enemy, not some abstract liberal free market that never existed. And I think he has a point. Well, now I come to my favorite, the reformists for global democracy. In a call to action from the UN Commission for Global Governance 1994, a number of ideas were put forward in order to reform the global system. An Economic Security Council was proposed. The Commission said that India and Brazil are more natural permanent members of the Security Council compared to Great Britain and France. This idea with the Security Council, it was a little similar to the Keynesian idea of this clearing union, I think, to control that some nations couldn't have extremely big surpluses used to dominate the world. It has also been suggested that there should be a reallocation of voting rights in the IMF and the World Bank in favor of poorer countries with smaller contributions. Today it's so that United States and European countries have an absolute majority in the IMF because they have put them in most money. But this declaration, alas, was soon forgotten, more or less. Here is something called the UNPH, United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. I'm myself active. You can join if you wish. It's very easy on internet. I have personally persuaded most of the members in the parliament of the left party to join this. It's very reformist. It says it's a first step. The different national parliaments, not the governments, but the parliaments should elect representatives to a parliamentary assembly within United Nations structures. But I think the long-term goal must be a directly elected world parliament. George Monbiot written a book saying, everything has been globalized except our consent. Democracy alone has been confined to the nation state. It stands at the national border, suitcase in hand, without a passport. This was written, I think, 2004. And it's very, if you see the situation today at the Hungarian border and so on, it's very sort of, yeah. And he says, globalization is not the problem. The problem is, in fact, that nation states have been able to operate so freely because the people of the world have no global means of restraining them. The four principal projects are these: a democratically elected world parliament, a democratized United Nations, an international clearing union, and a fair trade organization restraining the rich, emancipating the poor. And now I go over to a little sort of, I try to analyze with the trends in modern capitalism. First, I think you can see an increasing share of wealth of the financial capitalists at the expense of the industrial capitalists. In the eyes of the public, the anonymous and from production distant persons are more difficult to legitimate as rightful owner in the companies compared to the national industrial capitalists of the old type. A growing importance on knowledge and information. According to several estimates, intellectual assets of modern corporations are worth much more than tangible book value. So the content of the brain is extremely much more valuable for the companies, but it's not put in the book value. It is easier to control machines and buildings than the human brain. In many modern companies, the fear of losing key personnel is often greater than that of losing shareholders. Working and thinking individuals within the company have increasing possibilities to take over control themselves. Labor can hire capital instead of the other way around. And who is this? Her name is Elinor Ostrom, alas, she's not living anymore, but she was the first woman to get the Economy Prize, 2009. She tackles the question whether and how the exploration of common pool resources held in common can be organized in a way that avoids both excessive consumption and administrative costs. These resources are often held by economists to be exploitable only by privatization or enforcement imposed by outside force. Ostrom, by contrast, argues forcefully that other solutions exist and that stable institutions of self-government can be created if only certain problems of supply, credibility, and monitoring are solved. And here is an interesting man. It is difficult to place ideology in ideology. His name is Hernando de Soto. He is from Peru. Capitalism is in crisis in developing and former communist countries, not because international globalization is failing, but because they have been unable to globalize capital within themselves. Most people there view capitalism as a private club, a discriminatory system that benefits only the West and the elites who live inside the bell jars of poor countries. Most economic reform programs in poor economies may be falling into the trap that Karl Marx foresaw. The great contradiction of the capitalist system is that it creates its own demise because it cannot avoid concentrated capital in a few hands. And then I will also quote Martha Nussbaum. I will come back to her in the end. She writes about, I have put this in the literature list, about self-employed women's organization in Ahmedabad has helped more than 50,000 members with microcredits, education, healthcare, and labor union. This is just an example of quite a lot of this sort of self-organized organizations. Can you call it capitalist? No, it's not capitalist in the old sense, in the meaning. It's a sort of new sort of locally based market economy. Here is Martha Nussbaum. Through pension funds and trade union funds, organized labor in practice own a majority of the shares in many bigger companies today. In Canada, the trade union movement have transformed parts of their members' pension funds into solidarity funds, by means of which long-term strategies for ownership is developed. Mostly they will have to accept lower rates of return in the short run, but in the long run they will probably be able to secure a higher rate of employment and a more sustainable development. A number of studies have also shown that there is a positive correlation between employee ownership and long-term efficiency. And here is another favorite, Paul Mason. He writes, capitalism will be abolished by creating something more dynamic that exists at first, almost unseen within the old system, but which will break through, reshaping the economy around new values and behaviors. In Greece, when a grassroots NGO mapped the country's food co-ops, alternative producers, parallel currencies, and local exchange systems, they found more than 70 substantive projects and hundreds of smaller initiatives ranging from squats to carpools to free kindergartens. To mainstream economics, such things seem barely to qualify as economic activity. But that's the point. They exist because they trade, however haltingly and inefficiently, in the currency of post-capitalism. Free time, networked activity, and free stuff. New forms of ownership, new forms of lending, new legal contracts. A whole business subculture has emerged over the past 10 years. And here is another favorite, Rudolf Meidner, the father of the wage earners funds from the 70s, an old social democratic Marxist. He said, to Marx and Engels, the difficult task was to expropriate the expropriators. To 20th century socialists, the task is simpler. It is to use the power that is already embedded in the existent and ever-growing capital of the workers. World value surveys show that self-expression values and secular rational values have a growing importance compared to survival and traditional values. I like this because Sweden is up in the, you see, in the corner. We are strongest on self-expression values and strongest on secular rational values compared to so-called survival. What is important in life? People who answer, of course, mostly in poor nations, to eat and to have housing. But in Sweden, when you ask young people, they say, I want to have a job where I can develop my own ideas and have control over my own life. I have 3 girls, grandchildren in the ages in the 20s, and they all say this. I think they are not lying to me. They say that it's more important for me to have a job where I can control my life than to have a high salary. So this, all of it, it's in the direction of a sort of, perhaps, a new development. And this is my last slide. I will take it very fast because you can read it. It's on the course list. A decent political order must secure to all citizens at least a threshold level of these 10 central capabilities. Being able to live to the end of a human life of normal length, to be able to have good health, including reproductive health, to be able to move freely and having opportunities for sexual satisfaction, to be able to imagine and to think and reason in a truly human way, to be able to have attachment to things and people outside ourselves, to be able to engage in critical reflection with liberty of conscience, to be able to engage in politics without discrimination, to be able to live with concern for animals, plants, and the world of nature, to be able to laugh and play, and to be able to have control over one's work as a human being, entering into meaningful relationships with other workers. Well, I will end to say that the big problem with not only the left, I think it's a general political ideological phenomenon today, is pessimism. I mean, if you look around what's happening in Syria and so on, of course, it's easy to be pessimist. But I think that I will not survive to see it. But I think the world always changes. And capitalism will be disappearing in one way or another. And a better system will probably. If you excuse me that I have a little preach in the end. Thank you. You have a number of minutes to ask. Yeah.
I couldn't find the like Park and Bastard book anywhere. I searched all over it, and I couldn't find a way to read it as an ebook or. So I don't know if anybody else found it, but I couldn't.
I borrowed a copy at the School of Economics library.
I put a copy on Facebook.
What?
I put an electronic copy on the Facebook.
Oh, you have?
Yes.
Oh, could you see to send it to...
Anybody who's there.
One short. There's been like in popular culture or in culture within the West a trend with more leftist ideas about economics. For example, in Britain, they elected a newly appointed leftist minister, the Labour minister. But what is your view about the economics of Piketty?
Economics of
Piketty.
Piketty. Oh yeah. I will come back to Piketty on the 5th of October a little. But I'm basically very positive. And I think the critique against him is very missed the point. I mean, you can find some minor mistakes in the economic models, but he doesn't make a big thing about the economic model. The big idea is to show a fact, that is that the richer has been much richer, and we are almost back in the situation in the end of the 19th century. And also he shows that most of global wealth is inherited. I mean, you have some persons like Bill Gates who have created, you could say, in a certain way, their own fortunes, but most of global wealth is inherited. Just you happen to be born in a rich family. So I think it's a very efficient sort of destruction of some myths that have existed for a very long time. But I will, as I said, I will take up Piketty next time. Yeah.
Yeah, according to the reformist point of view, you mentioned that the distribution of resources is needed, right?
What is needed?
The redistribution of let's say, resources. So, what would be like the mechanism that you would use, like through taxation, or what is like the mechanism?
Yes. Basically,
I think the big global problems, you can take the climate effect, for instance. My colleague here on the School of Economics, Thomas Sterne, who was a member of this international panel, the United Nations, he has suggested a global carbon dioxide tax. And it's the same argument as a Tobin tax. You must have it global. And of course it's very difficult to have this. He shows, among other things, that only if you, in the United States, you make the petrol tax higher at the level of the European level, that will mean extreme positive effect on global effect. But of course, it's very difficult for Obama to do this for himself. So we must have a sort of global negotiation, and I will come back also to this sort of thing on my last lecture, because my thesis then is that the welfare state cannot survive if we haven't got a certain amount of global taxing, because otherwise rich people will have tax havens and go away with their money if we can't collect it in some way, and if we are going to have global taxing, we must have a global democracy, because we don't, I think, want to have some new global dictator like Stalin or so. Yeah. Okay. See you on 5th of October.